from Mark built right here, about a mile away. But we've asked him to come in at every school and talk a little bit about suspension. Mark's been to our school, so he understands the rider's inputs and how important what you do with your bodies are, which I think is important. And that's why we like supporting him. He understands the riding side of it as well. So Mark from Mark built, all yours.
What's the difference between 20 mil, 25 mil, 30 mil? Why is it important to switch to an aftermarket suspension over my stock stuff? Like, all these are, questions that I really get a lot. So this is actually a stock cartridge kit from an R6, and I'm sure that you've all ridden the R6 over the past 2 days. And this stock is a 20 millimeter valve. So you can see the diameter of the valve, and what the valve does is that's what controls the oil flow through the suspension. Controls the dampening. So picture a Cadillac driving down the street, the car stays straight and the tires move up and down when it hits the bumps. Picture a Porsche when it hits the same bumps, the whole car moves, stiffer damping. So how this works is it's a round valve with a bunch of holes in it, and the oil is forced through those holes as the rod moves through the damping tube. Okay, pretty simple design. And what they do is they stack a bunch of flexible metal shims on top of this valve on either side. And it's the deflection, the bending of those metal shims out of the way as the oil passes through the valve that controls how fast or how slow the damping rod travels. There's two things that really affect suspension and that the aftermarket manufacturers are constantly trying to battle and make better. And one of those is oil viscosity. So as the oil passes through this valve, it generates a lot of heat, especially on a small valve like a 20 millimeter valve. Picture when you turn your garden hose on and the water flows out the garden hose, just kind of trickles out the end, and then you put your thumb over the end, you're trying to squirt your friends with it. Well, it's exactly the same theory. The bigger the valve, the slower the force of the oil through the valve. The smaller the valve, the higher the force, so it sprays the water further, right? So on a smaller valve, you have to stack a lot more shims, a lot more metal to control that oil flow. And what that does is makes the suspension feel a little bit harsh over the bumps, because you have to try to slow that oil down through the big strokes, but yet through the small strokes, it has to take a lot of force to open all that metal. So what they came up with was 25 mil. So they went 5 millimeters bigger on the valve. And if you notice, this is a stock 20 millimeter valve. Can everybody see how much metal is stacked up on top of that? You can see there's a pretty big shim stack of metal on there. Okay. Can you guys see on top of this 25 millimeter valve how much thinner it is? It's probably 30% of what the 20 millimeter valve is, right? So what does that mean to us? Basically means that in the slower shaft speeds, it's able to bend those shims up much easier. So now we've done what? We've kept the oil more stable, and we've helped to reduce the bumps. One step further, 30 mil. See the big size of the valve? Now I have a 30 millimeter valve. This happens to be a compression side. What they've done now with the 30 millimeter stuff is, in order to help reduce heat even more in viscosity breakdown, they've taken the compression and put it in one leg of the fork, and the rebound and put it in the other leg of the fork. Any idea why they've done that? Well, the valve only has to do one job, so it's going to generate heat only on one side of the stroke. Theoretically, half the amount of heat, right? A compression leg is going to generate heat on the compression stroke, rebound is going to generate heat on the rebound stroke, as opposed to in both directions, twice as much heat every stroke, right? So again, trying to keep the temperature of the oil more stable. You'll also notice coatings. I'm going to pass this around quick. I want you guys to feel this, because this is probably the slipperiest coating I've ever felt on any suspension component, and it's another big difference that you'll see between aftermarket and OEM suspensions is how much less stiction, which is a term that we use, the product has as it goes through the stroke. So just pass that around quick and you guys can feel that coating. And that has no oil on it, that's dry. The other improvement that they've come up with over the years, and I'm sure you've all heard of it, is gas charged. So all of our shocks have a nitrogen canister, so it pressurizes the oil. And what it does is it separates the oil from the air. There's no air inside the shock. It's filled completely with oil. There's a dividing piston that floats, and then there's gas on the backside of the dividing piston. And the purpose of that is oil under pressure basically will not cavitate. And what is cavitation? When the air and the oil are mixed together, especially in a fork, because there's air in the oil, as it's forced at high velocity through that tiny valve, it foams the oil, which is cavitation. So if you separate the air away from the oil and put it under pressure, it keeps it way more stable, no foaming, no cavitation. So what they've done is developed fork kits now where this is actually a sealed unit, and this is completely ready to use. If you look, all the damping's in there, and you see it springs back on its own because it's under gas pressure. So you could actually put this in the fork with no other oil, and it works. Like, this is a complete sealed system. The only reason you would add oil to the outside of this is to keep the seals and the sliders and everything internally in the fork lubricated. But this is the full thing, and it's gas charged through the bottom. It's just a little fill port for the gas in the bottom. And again, dividing piston in the bottom separates the gas from the oil, keeps it more stable, basically zero cavitation. And this works under the same principle as the 30 mil kit, where it separates compression and rebound into separate legs to reduce the heat and the viscosity breakdown in half. Oil we use as a tuning tool. Inside fork, shock, everything has a spring, right? Coil spring. The purpose of the coil spring is to hold up the weight of the rider and the motorcycle. So inside the fork, you have a coil spring. You also have an oil level. Now, we know that air is compressible, right? We all understand that air compressor, tires, right? Air is compressible. Oil is not compressible. So the amount of oil we put in the fork will help us determine how stiff the fork gets as it progressively travels through the bottom of the stroke. Higher oil level, less air to compress, the stiffer it gets as it travels through the stroke. Lower oil level, more air, the less progressively stiff it gets as it gets through the bottom of the stroke. Everybody kind of understands that concept? Okay, yeah, so we use oil as a tuning tool. Like on an R6, we run 200 millimeters. Our standard setup is 200 millimeters oil level. And then in the other leg, we usually just put 15 cc's, and that just keeps things lubricated. Interesting, right? I kind of brought a nice little piece of eye candy with to show you guys. This is the World Superbike fork. It's a TTX design, meaning it's dual tubes inside, so as it flows the oil, keeps constant pressure on both sides of the damping rod, so it flows the oil up and around and then back in underneath, as opposed to trying to displace the oil. Instead of having a shim valve and a shim stack, the piston is solid. So all the piston is doing is moving the oil. All the damping is done in the valves, which are in the body here. So the oil flows around through the valve and then back up in. So the cool thing about this is, again, we talk about heat, right? So where you have the valves on the shaft themselves, it's transferring that heat directly to the oil and to the dampening rod and to the tube. The heat's generated here at the valve. Well, what do you have here? Nice big aluminum heat sink, right? Helps dissipate that heat really quickly. We also have gas pressure, so it's a sealed system under gas pressure. No foaming, no cavitation, right? And this is very similar to the TTX shock. Same thing, your valves are here, as opposed to being on the bottom of the fork leg. Solid pistons, so no shims on the piston. Just displaces the oil up through the valves and back around to the opposite side of the piston. Maintains constant pressure on both sides of the piston. And your valving is done right here in the cylinder head. Helps disperse that heat through that nice big heat sink, keep things cool. The other cool thing about this is, if we want to tune these forks, revalve them, make any changes, instead of having to pull the whole thing apart to get to the valves inside, all we have to do is bleed off the nitrogen pressure, unbolt these valves out, and everything is right there on the valve. Make a small change, screw those valves right back in, re-nitrogen it, put the shock back on the bike. I can literally revalve the shock in about 15 to 18 minutes. Yeah, pretty neat. They make the Rodent track forks, which I'm sure a lot of you guys see. This Triumph 675R comes with a set of Öhlins OEM Rodent track forks. The big difference between these and those is these are gas pressure, TTX design, so the valving's in the housing. So when you buy a Rodent track fork from Öhlins now, this is what you're getting inside, a 30 mil kit. So compression in one leg, rebound in the other, but it's not gas cartridge, it's still emulsion. a really good product. They work fantastic. They used to be the 25 mil design, which we talked about a little bit earlier. So the older ones are 25 mil setup. You know, they work phenomenally, obviously, because it's a really nice set of forks with titanium nitride coating on the sliders for durability and less stiction. You know, the way the oil paths are very efficient, so they don't generate a lot of heat. And again, top quality internals. So you're still getting a really good product. You're just not getting eye candy. So.
Good stuff.
Good stuff.
All right. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you, guys.